You're listening to Now I've Heard Everything, conversations with the icons of our time.
I think that the perceived costs of engagement are really seen to be much, much greater than the non-costs of non-engagement. And I think that ultimately there has been no leadership in service of stopping these horrors.
Former UN Ambassador Samantha Power, today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has inspired many people to use a very strong word in discussing and debating and protesting, and that word is genocide. Now, one of the strongest voices on behalf of human rights in our time is former UN Ambassador Samantha Power. A former war correspondent, Power then entered public service and has long been a champion of the oppressed of the world. She's written several books, the first of which was a 2002 volume that she called A Problem from Hell. It was a study of how the United States has responded to various genocides in the 20th century. And even though this conversation took place over 20 years ago, its relevance today cannot be overlooked. So here now, from 2002, Samantha Power.
I was a reporter in Bosnia during the war there and had watched Muslim men and boys herded into concentration camps and innocent women and children picked off bicycles. And I was upset about it and returned to this country and was surprised to see that not that many other people were, and that we had a real commitment to Holocaust awareness in this country, but it hadn't translated into a desire to see that those kinds of crimes were not repeated.
Despite all the cries from politicians, never again, that we will never let this happen again.
That's right, and I think when they say never again, perhaps they mean never again should genocide happen, rather than the kind of agency that I heard in that summons, that moral summons of never again. But yeah, the Holocaust Museum on the Mall had opened in 1993, and American presidents have, of course, made a ritual, and other civic and political leaders had made a ritual of going there, and I actually think they meant it when they said it, but there was something about the way that they were processing atrocity as it happened in real time, in their time, that made them see those commitments as not pertinent in the moment.
Well, essentially, your book, if I may grossly oversimplify, is we have a problem putting our money where our mouth is.
Yeah, our money and our words and our
troops.
And our troops occasionally. Although I do want to stress that the shocking revelation of the book is not the non-military intervention, because, I happen to think that military intervention to stop genocide is appropriate, but I may be in the minority in this country in that view. What is shocking is that we've done so little along a continuum of intervention, from economic sanctions and diplomatic condemnation and denunciation to using our technical assets to jam hate radio, which is being used to broadcast the names and addresses of potential victims and the kind of hate that stokes people into killing. A whole host of things that we might have done that we just turn away from doing.
And even, it strikes me, once it reaches the point where we say, all right, we'll send in some military, we're so darn afraid of getting our fingernail broken, it seems, that we lob bombs from miles away, hoping it might do some good. We're not getting our hands dirty in this.
Well, I think that politicians through the century, and I look from the Armenia genocide until Kosovo at the end, including Rwanda and Cambodia and the Holocaust itself, I think that the perceived costs of engagement are really seen to be much, much greater than the non-costs of non-engagement. And ultimately, policymakers are rational actors. They want to get back into office. They want to continue to make decisions that affect the fortunes of American citizens. And I think that ultimately there has been no leadership in service of stopping these horrors, and very little public pressure on the outside forcing them to change their calculus.
Well, as you observe in this book, no president has ever been punished politically for failing to act.
Right, and thus it is not a coincidence that they continue to avoid the potential risks of involvement. I think people see Vietnam, they see Somalia, they see September 11th, and they scurry around in the bureaucracy and they say, you know what, we can't let these kinds of things happen again. What they don't do is scurry around the bureaucracy saying we can't let 800,000 people die in 100 days, as happened in 1994 in Rwanda. So it's a grim tale of an absence of leadership on the outside and an absence, I think, of outside pressure really from the rest of us. But it's also an extraordinary tale of American heroism, surprisingly. And I hadn't expected to come upon these characters, but there are amazing Americans in our country's past who've not been recognized in the past. Indeed, they've largely been demonized, who have stood up and who have tried to summon our government to do more in the face of these monstrosities.
Well, indeed, your book is very character-driven in many ways.
It is. I mean, and it wasn't even a trope on my part. It wasn't as if I said, I'll sell more books if I can write this like a crime thriller. These were men and women, a few women, who stood up and who simply took their colleagues and this government to task and said, we can be better. We can do more. Even by speaking out, we will at least be signaling the perpetrators that there is at least a rhetorical sanction to committing these crimes. And don't forget, and this was an extraordinary revelation for me, people who commit genocide for the most part have never killed before. Every day they're deciding how far to go. They're looking left and they're looking right, and they're seeing who's legitimating what form of behavior at what time. And what's so sad and tragic, and where you just want to go back in time about the U.S. response, is that mere words actually can deter horrors of this nature. Again, for people who are looking, their moral universe is getting skewed, their compass is going round and round, and we have a unique opportunity, really, as the United States, with the kind of moral, political, and indeed military power that we have behind us, to deter people from going there.
There are indeed precious few times in the last century in which we have taken some kind of action, as you catalog in the book, but apparently in most of those times that we have tried something, it has worked.
I've been very impressed with the effectiveness of both high-level diplomatic interventions, and I say high-level because I don't mean just the ritual negotiation processes. I mean when a president actually makes an issue out of the commission of atrocity, doesn't run away from using what became known as the G word or the genocide word to describe the crimes, but actually uses the bully pulpit, the largest bully pulpit in the history of mankind, I might add, and says, you know what, we're not tolerating this, and is actually willing to invest some of his political capital in deterring these atrocities. It really is very, very surprising. And in the two interventions, military interventions that we've seen, one in August of 1995 in Bosnia, when Bill Clinton began to feel tremendous political pressure to do something about the 3.5-year war there and the plight of the Muslims. That intervention and the intervention in Kosovo, neither of them were perfect, but both of them brought a nearly immediate end to the killing.
Now, I have to tell you, earlier today, Todd Gitlin was here. He's the professor from NYU, a wonderful authority. He's got a book on how saturated in the media we are, and he makes the point in his book, he made during the interview, that in 98, 99, we were looking at some serious issues. We had some serious problems going on elsewhere in the world, but he says, the headlines were the stupid blue dress from the Gap.
Well, that would be the way, if we were thinking about getting bottom-up political pressure on the president. I think it would be, we would have to figure out a way to channel the public's attention and to kind of develop a sort of, a siren system by which, the public recognizes that the commitments that they made when they went to the Holocaust Museum to themselves and to their neighbors actually had real-time consequences. But I think the problem is not a lack of information, although certainly the press could do better and the public could do better just in calling their congressmen and saying, it actually matters to me that 10,000 Tutsi a day are dying in Rwanda. That would have made a huge difference on Capitol Hill. And I think that's really the main pressure point for the grassroots. But I think the real issue is, how do we get elite opinion to own this issue? How do we get the editorial boards in the New York Times and the Washington Post? How do we get non-governmental groups? How do we get ethnic lobbies? How do we get, leading church leaders rather than necessarily their constituencies? I mean, their constituencies would be great, but it's very difficult to move the masses of the American people, and foreign policy rarely does it. It does it sometimes when Americans get into trouble abroad. The American people will speak out and speak up and urge the U.S. to walk out. But when it comes to actually urging a particular form of U.S. engagement. It's very rare that you'll see the kind of grassroots groundswell that we might like, but that I think might be putting the bar too high. There is hope in the elite approach, and I don't mean an elitist approach, because the elite is, in a sense, it's grass tops. It's just not grassroots. You know, they're speaking for the people. And they're helping educate the people. I mean, a lot of these places are foreign and distant, and nobody's heard of them, and it's confusing. You know, I think we all need filters, and what we need is editorial boards, journalists, you mentioned, non-governmental groups, to help us filter this massive information and to help do triage, in a sense, with our daily lives, so we know which ones to pay more attention to, which are just war and which are genocide.
Is there any legitimacy to any of those elites saying, I didn't know what was going on over there. We had no idea the full extent of the carnage?
Well, you know, Clinton, in his Rwanda apology, he went to Rwanda and apologized for the genocide, sort of. What he said was not we didn't know, but what he said was we didn't fully appreciate the depth and the speed of the terror which engulfed these poor people. To me, that is question-begging. I have looked at thousands of pages of declassified documents, government documents, looked at the press record, which is open source, which we all had access to, and the information is available. It is available within days of the beginning of this kind of systematic atrocity. Now, whether the president chooses to appreciate or not, to some extent, again, is a product of how he chooses to prioritize. With genocide not on the map as an interest of the United States, with a president not having told his foreign policy team that it matters to him that atrocities are happening, it's not surprising that people keep Rwanda off of his desk and put North Korea, Iraq, and some of the more central concerns on his desk. So it's up to him, in a sense, or her, hopefully, to signal the rest of, you know, his teammates, in a sense, in the service of making foreign policy, that it matters to him, that he wants to hear, and that he wants to appreciate. Otherwise, this knowledge is inconvenient, and nobody's going to seek it. But it's available. I mean, it's available at a scale and at a level of detail that I had not understood before I reviewed the record.
Do you get any sense at all that after September 11th, Americans are a little less willing to run off, even if they want to run off and help somebody else, thinking, come on, we got to guard our own borders first?
I think there's definitely that feeling, and thus I think it's important as we think about how to respond to genocide that we look at the response possibilities as tools in a toolkit, you know, or in a toolbox. We have technical means to jam hate radio and television. We can rally troops from other countries if we take a political lead and if we name the atrocities for what they are. We can help prosecute the perpetrators of genocide and crimes against humanity. We can denounce at a high level. And it may be that in the near term anyway, our troops are otherwise deployed. And it may be that we have to recognize that and work with our European partners and with, indeed, the regional neighbors of places where genocide is likely to happen to do contingency military planning, where it's clear that what the United States may do is supply airlift and logistic support, but what other troops from other countries may supply is the actual capacity to confront the perpetrators of these crimes. But again, let's not make, you know, let's not make the best the enemy of the good. You know, we have the capacity to do a whole host of things that don't involve sending our troops. And in terms of where the American people are now, I think you're right that we all have a sense of being vulnerable, and that makes us just close ranks just a little more and probably a little less outward oriented. On the other hand, I think it's the first time in America's history that we've had the capacity really to identify with the victims of genocide, because you know, in 1915, it was enough to earn a death sentence to be an Armenian. In 1939, 1941, 1945, it was enough to be a Jew. In 1994, it was enough to be a Tutsi. And on September 11th, 2001, it was enough to be an American. And I think that our capacity to identify with potential victims of these crimes has to be greater as a result of that understanding and that identification.
Where in the before we close, where in the world right now are the spots that we should be looking, where we should be watching closely?
Well, I think Burundi in the Great Lakes region, next to Rwanda, has a very similar ethnic dynamic. Nelson Mandela has taken the lead there in a peace process, but the United States is not paying much attention to that country. And I think, again, even though it is a sort of European and African zone of influence, without American leadership, others take the signal that the country is not worthy of paying attention to. So even though we would like to think that, well, if we don't lead, somebody else will, the reality is, without American leadership, people think that they're being told, don't bother leading, it doesn't matter. So Burundi is a very worrying spot. I would also say, frankly, that Chechnya is becoming ever more worrying. Indeed, one of the consequences of the war on terrorism, and not the war on terror, because we're not yet making war on genocide, is that we are giving our allies in that struggle carte blanche to do just about whatever they want behind their borders. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that we invade Russia to stop the atrocities against the Muslims in Chechnya, but I do think to send Putin a signal that he can do what he wants is a big mistake, and you've seen an escalation in the violence there, I think, as a result of the signals that the Bush administration has sent him.
Samantha Power is 53 now. She's currently the administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development. Now you can get your copy of A Problem from Hell by Samantha Power by tapping the link in our show notes or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. HeardEverything.com is where you can also hear my 2003 interview with former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright.
There was a question, frankly, could a woman be Secretary of State, especially in dealing with men in Arab countries? And what I found was that I had no problems abroad, mostly because I arrived in a very large plane that said United States of America.
And my 2006 conversation with Nobel Peace Prize winner Wangari Maathai.
We saw how people in power refused to be the custodians of the resources as they were expected, and instead used their position to enrich themselves with the resources.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And you can find us everywhere you listen to podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, he is the co-founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center. We'll revisit my 1991 conversation with attorney Morris Dees.
I find out your average white supremacist, whether it be a skinhead, Klansman, or whatever, really not a bad person. They get involved with the Klan, they get involved with these groups because they're looking for something to give their life meaning. They have low self-esteem.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.